Let me begin by thanking the sponsor of this event, the South Korean Ministry of Unification. We had an event about a year ago, very successful. We're doing our best this year as well. Let me thank our crew, Alex, Natalie, all our research interns, great work putting this event together. So what is happening today? Well, just a few days ago, we celebrated 35 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. South Korean scholars, policymakers have paid great attention to the fall of the Berlin Wall since the end of the Cold War. Is this precedent still applicable? Well, today we have, well, with my exception, a very distinguished group of diplomats, policymakers, human rights defenders, who have been extraordinarily active in both worlds during the Cold War and post-Cold War, dealing with North Korean human rights. So I think this is going to be quite a treat today, and I thank you very much for being here today. So those were my very brief introductory remarks. Again, we're hosting this at the DACOR Bacon House of John Marshall, founding father of the Supreme Court, Secretary of War, Secretary of State. So this building is a true symbol of U.S. democracy, the U.S. justice system, U.S. diplomats. We're truly blessed to be housed here and to have our events here at the DACOR Bacon House. We're truly blessed to have our board members, Ambassador Robert King, who's going to be a speaker on the first panel, the Honorable Roberta Cohen, former co-chair of HRNK, currently co-chair emeritus, Colonel David Maxwell, a member of the board here, and thank you all. Tae-hyun, you're the Unification Attaché here in Washington. Thank you for the great work you're doing to continue to preserve this great alliance, friendship, and partnership we have with the Republic of Korea. Thank you all. Guido Krause, thank you for representing the German Embassy and the people of Germany today. So this is all terrific. Great to see friends. So, we're going to proceed with panel one. And Alex, I think I'm going to need your help with navigating that PowerPoint presentation. Maybe I should just stand here as I proceed with my modest remarks so that I may see the PowerPoint, and then I'll join the panel, and we'll definitely take it from here. Okay, Natalie, thank you. So, we talked about this, and as you know, as some of you know, I was born and raised in communist Romania. I was 20 years old during the anti-communist revolution of December 1989. I was as president and CEO of the U.S. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, HRNK. And there's a little bit more to the story. I was the first Romanian ever to study in South Korea on a South Korean government scholarship. I could be showing you gory pictures of the 1989 revolution and the two Ceausescus being shot by a firing squad. I'm not going to begin by doing that. My family, we're a bunch of hoarders. So I am going to offer you a glimpse into life in Romania in the 1970s and 1980s very quickly. Natalie, thank you very much for the help with putting together this PowerPoint. Okay, so where did we get our exact time? You hear a lot of this, Slava Ukraina, right? Glory to Ukraine. Well, there's a Soviet-made Slava alarm clock. That's where we got our exact time. Okay, it's still working today, by the way. It's miraculous. My mother has it. Next one, please. Okay, so in Romania, in the late 1970s and 1980s, things were very similar to North Korea. Why? I will show this to you very soon, but Ceausescu visited North Korea for the first time in 1971, fell in love with Kim Il-sung and his style of cult of personality. He borrowed tremendous amounts of money from overseas to forcibly develop his industry, turn agricultural workers into industrial workers. He was trying really hard to pay back his foreign debt. He made it. He paid it in full. But for the ordinary people of Romania, this is a terrible thing. So, you have no heat in your apartments. There you go. It's a space heater from the 1980s. You turn it on, if it works, great. If it doesn't, if they cut off power as well, tough luck. There's no heat in the house. My mother is a linguist, God bless her soul. She's 85 years old. She still writes and reads. She had to write with gloves on and a winter coat on inside her home, 2 degrees centigrade inside their apartment, 35 degrees Fahrenheit. The next one, please, another space heater. You needed these in your home. The next one, please. Okay, so that's, the small refrigerator you have in your house, small, empty. Whoever, is missing those times in Eastern Europe, good luck to all of them. 1980s, this used to be the breadbasket of Europe. Ambassador King knows, Roberta Cohen knows, Dave Maxwell knows. People will stand in food lines for hours and hours, for days and days, for the basic necessities of life. Again, we are orders, we get these things, maybe we'll set up some museum one day, I don't know. I'll bring this stuff to the States. Next one, please, Natalie. Okay, what about young people? Okay, that's me, young pioneer, okay? What do we know? Nothing. Okay, so everybody wants to be a young pioneer. Why? Because that's the supreme honor. Then, everybody becomes a member of the Union of the Communist Youth, and then, you're top of your class in college. They say, hey, you're the first one in line to become a member of the Communist Party. Would you like to? What do you say? You say, no, you're done for the rest of your life. Fortunately, the regime came before they made me this offer, so I was never a member of the Communist Party. Next one, please. So as kids, what did we like? We liked model planes. I loved model planes. The East German model planes were the best ones. Soviet-made ones were awful. The parts wouldn't fit together. Whenever I had an opportunity, I avoided the Soviet signs on the plane. Okay, you see, this is Czechoslovakia. All right, next one, please. Again, Soviet strategic bomber. Okay, we loved assembling them. We're kids. Kids will be kids. Kids are kids in North Korea as well. That's how it worked for us. Next one, please. Okay, now, we're supposed to talk about information communication. How did you communicate inside the country? You see a rotary phone right there. That's it. Okay, domestic communications, you've got them talking to people overseas. If you had a relative, you're definitely under surveillance. Well, okay, my family, my mother had a cousin whose husband was Jewish Romanian, so they were members of the Bucharest Philharmonic. The husband defected first because he was Jewish Romanian. Yeah, he went, for a concert overseas and he stayed, and then the wife went overseas, she stayed, they went to Israel and Switzerland. There was this joke, what do you call the Romanian Philharmonic after an overseas tour? A quartetto, because only 4 came back, right? So anyway, this is a glimpse into how things were like. It looks antiquated, but this was not the 1950s, it was the 1980s, right? Next one, please. Okay, now, enters Ambassador Robert King, who will tell you that he was Chief of Research for Radio Free Europe. That's where you got your news from the outside world, the radio. You listen to Deutsche Welle from Cologne, from Köln, the Federal Republic of Germany. You listen to Radio Free Europe. You listen to Voice of America. And, this was really the news we trusted. When the regime was falling down in December 1989, we did not trust the nonsensical news we're getting from our own communist regime. We would only trust these stations. And that's how it was. Extraordinarily important role they played. In North Korea today, Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, the stations based in South Korea, they continue to play a very important role. I know, it's the 21st century, it's the year 2024, but still there's a tightly controlled information environment. Radio still matters. Natalie, the next one, please. Okay, so what else did you have? You had LP players. This is a Polish-made Unitra Phonica LP player. I know it looks really primitive, but it was, amazing back in the day. You'd buy smuggled LPs. How did we smuggle them in? Just like North Koreans smuggle stuff in from Dandong, China into Sinŭiju, across the Freedom Bridge. We got stuff smuggled from the former Yugoslavia into Timișoara, Romania. That's where the revolution broke out in December 1989. So yeah, you get to listen to the rock bands from the outside world. My generation grew up on smuggled records, on Iron Maiden, Metallica, the Scorpions, you name it. I still go to their concerts. My family and I are slated to go to UVA for a Metallica concert. The last one I'm going to attend. It was not cheap. Next one, please. Okay, we had our own underground rock bands. The North Koreans do not have that. This is Iris, all right? These guys are awesome. They were never on TV or on radio, but this tells you that Eastern Europe was still different from North Korea. So we had these guys, they're pretty amazing. You go to the Black Sea, you go to a resort, you get to listen to the guys. Next slide, please. I got their autograph signatures. Best day ever, all right? So I was at this club, it's like 3 o'clock in the morning, I see the guys, I get their signatures. I still have the stuff. I hope there'll be something, worth something someday, we'll see. I'll wait for the next 150 years. Next one, please. Okay, what else? Ceausescu was shutting down everything in the 1980s. We could not watch the Olympic Games. We could not watch soccer World Cups. I watched the Seoul Olympics in 1988 on Bulgarian TV. We had these contraptions, these antennas that allowed people in the South to watch Bulgarian TV, in the East Soviet TV, in the West Hungarian, if you're lucky it was German TV. So 1990, communism falls down. This is the best thing ever. 1990 Soccer World Cup. Okay, the brackets. I had never done brackets before. I did brackets for the first time in 1990. Italy in 1990. The Romanians did pretty well. In 1994 in the USA, they did even better. Hopefully they'll do better in 2 years. So, these very, very basic joys of life, you just didn't have them. Next, Natalie, please. What did we have? We had books. I grew up in a household full of books. Perhaps not everybody did that, but I was fortunate to do that. You can look at the titles. Next one, please. History of art. You see the great Russian classics, War and Peace, Tolstoy, Sholokhov. And next, okay, we couldn't travel abroad. We were not allowed to leave the country. The first time I left was after the fall of communism, when I left for Korea. But we read Jules Verne, right? All about sci-fi and world travel, and that's how imagination develops, and that's how you get to dream of other things. Next, Natalie, please. You can see Shakespeare, Jack London, very disorganized. This is my room, I'm sorry. Back in Romania, I took this picture just a few weeks ago. So, the complete works of William Shakespeare, Jack London, you see Faulkner, you see Cornelius Ryan, The Longest Day, you can recognize that in Romanian, that's Ziua Cea Mai Lungă. So, unlike the North Koreans, you did have some access to memories of the old world, to different political systems, good, bad, terrible. You still had the books in households that respected reading, literature, and books. And that's one big difference. The next one. Okay, how many of you have watched the new Shogun with Anna Sawai? It's great, isn't it? Shogun was a huge deal in Eastern Europe in the 1980s. You would not believe this. So, this is a translation of James Clavell's Shogun, translated into Romanian under communist Romania, all right? The movie was only available on VHS tape. smuggled. Owning a video player was the cost of a Romanian-made car, the equivalent of $80,000 today. It was only the very few who had access to foreign travel and foreign currency. But we loved watching the old series with Mihune Toshio and who was it? Richard Chamberlain, right? That was the old one. Great. Next one, please. So Shogun was a huge cultural phenomenon in Eastern Europe in the 1980s. And the next one, because we're almost done. Okay, what about these men became best friends in 1971? Why? How did this happen? Why did Ceausescu want to turn Romania into the North Korea of Eastern Europe? Look at that guy in the left corner. That's Ambassador Isidor Urian. He was my first private teacher of Korean in Korea when I first arrived there, because he was the first ambassador of Romania to South Korea, trained at Kim Il-sung University. You know, my colleagues say, oh my God, you're meeting the ambassador again 3 times a week. I say, do you know how many Romanians there are in Seoul? No, how many? 3? Okay, so yeah, we have dinner 3 times a week. Great teacher of Korean, so he was the interpreter for Kim Il-sung and Ceausescu. He told me one thing. Okay, why did Ceausescu love North Korea? For one simple reason. This guy was a man of no vices. You know, he knew nobody but his wife. He didn't drink, didn't smoke. He had one vice. That was to give these insanely boring speeches before large crowds of people. You know, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso did it for him. David Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia did it for him. Others did it for him, but nobody was better than Kim Il-sung. They were absolutely perfect. You had tens of thousands of North Koreans singing Romanian songs, you know, carrying Romanian slogans and banners. So that's how the guy absolutely fell in love with the North Korean cult of personality. Is this eternal? No, it is not eternal. Does a dictatorship last forever? No, it doesn't. Did we know about the fall of the Berlin Wall in Romania? Thank you, Bob. Only from, Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. That's how we knew it. And eventually, we brought it down too. And I was out in the streets. And, this is, the introduction to our program is not meant to be a, scholarly presentation. We have scholars here on the panel. It's, supposed to be a more personal kind of thing. To conclude, I have a video, Natalie. This will show you a very famous, okay, so we have some images of the Romanian Revolution. You've seen a lot of these as well, no worries. I was there, really messy. I don't wish this onto anyone, especially our North Korean friends. We hope for peaceful, gradual transformation of North Korea. You got the video? Is it there?
Exit the presentation.
I can give you a hand with that. So that's a video of a popular artist in North Korea singing a traditional Romanian song for Ceausescu. Nobody has seen the guy as happy as he was watching that performance done for him in North Korea. This will tell you why he fell in love with the North Korean cult of personality the way he did. Okay, so that's it. So, a lot of similarities and some fundamental differences. Romanians, Eastern Europeans had memories of previous political systems. Very close society, Romania. We still had the books and the memories of our parents and grandparents. The North Koreans do not have that. Is change still possible in North Korea? Of course it is. No dictatorship lasts forever. And we will hear more from our distinguished speakers. Of course, Roberta Cohen, who's our co-chair emeritus, a top specialist in human rights and humanitarian issues. Again, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. Roberta will tell you about her work with Eastern European dissidents in the 1970s and afterwards, her work on this extraordinarily important issue of North Korean human rights. And of course, Ambassador Robert King, we in the world of North Korean human rights remember Ambassador Robert King as a terrific former special envoy for North Korean human rights and as chief of staff to the late Congressman Tom Lantos, the only Holocaust survivor to ever sit in the US Congress. And Ambassador King has a very long history dealing with human rights, democracy, and freedom in Eastern Europe as well. And Ambassador King will tell us the story as well. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. Thank you.
These are very tense times now. And I'm going to take you all back to another tense time by speaking about the Soviet Union and some of the lessons I learned from dealing with human rights in that country, which may be useful in the case of North Korea. My remarks will go back to the year 1970, when Leonid Brezhnev headed the Soviet Union and was building up its nuclear power in competition with the US. That same year, the foremost thermonuclear weapons scientist in the Soviet Union, Andrei Sakharov, announced the creation of a non-governmental human rights group, the Moscow Human Rights Committee, together with two colleagues, Valery Chalitsa and Andrei Tredeklebov. What concerned Sakharov was the development of nuclear power unchecked by the observance of human rights. Does that sound familiar? In his view, the defense of human rights was the only sure foundation for lasting international cooperation and international peace. When he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1975, he said, and this is a quote from his lecture, "I am convinced that international trust, mutual understanding, disarmament, and international security are inconceivable without an open society with freedom of information, freedom of conscience, the right to publish, and the right to travel and choose the country in which one wishes to live." He also argued that there had to be public discussion of such issues as thermonuclear missile and ecological threats. Democracy, he said, is the only satisfactory road for a country's development. Excerpts from Sakharov's Nobel lecture and other writers and other writings of his ought to be included in the information sent into or broadcast to North Korea today, hopefully reaching the elite, defense establishment, and nuclear scientists. Although under the thumb of the regime, and we have a very good picture of that in HRNK's recent report, but some, if they heard this, would no doubt find the thinking of the Soviet Union's H-bomb father refreshing and perhaps compelling. Because of Sakharov's reputation, the Soviet response to the Moscow Human Rights Committee was initially cautious. The group, for its part, was also careful to do nothing that could be said to be outside of the law. The members met at Sakharov's apartment, and they studied the Soviet Constitution and law, as well as the provisions in UN human rights treaties, which the Soviet Union had signed, in particular the international covenants on civil and political and economic and social rights. Committee members requested dialogue with government officials over individual cases, And Chalitza wrote essays for Samizdat, that was the unofficial publications, about the rights of Soviet citizens. To reinforce its standing, the committee requested affiliation with the International League for Human Rights, which was a New York-based international human rights NGO in consultative status with the United Nations. I was the International League's executive director at the time and worked with the committee. What are the lessons learned that may have some relevance to North Korea? First, the significance of international human rights standards. Sometimes they may be the only way that human rights advocates in a country have to evaluate their government's practices and try to hold them to account. Because of this potential of holding them to account, KGB agents in Moscow raided Chalitza's apartment, and what did they confiscate? The texts of the covenants and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we at the International League began to read out by phone over the open lines to Chalitza and Sakharov each month the provisions of the covenants that the Soviet Union had signed. Some of the calls got interrupted, but quite enough got through, and then we found other ways to get the texts to them as well. North Korea has acceded to 5 international human rights agreements: the covenants, women's rights, children's rights, the rights of the disabled. And they agreed in principle prior to the pandemic to the UN's training of its foreign ministry officials in UN procedures and the human rights provisions of treaties North Korea signed. A few were trained in 2019 in Geneva, but this has not continued. I would suggest, again, that the groups that send information into or broadcast into North Korea highlight for people in the country, not just officials, the commitments to children, disabled people, civil and political rights, the right to food, health care, was just about no one in the country knows about. I remember one Soviet mathematician who memorized the covenants and told me that their existence got him through being incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital. A second lesson is the importance of information access and exchange. The Moscow Committee and other groups in the Soviet Union were quite adept at developing ways to send information to the outside world. And when the information reached the media, the UN, government, scientific, lawyers, religious groups, trade unions, and also Western communist parties, there were results. The world outside also found ways to bring publications and information into the country to be circulated samizdat by the local groups. Now, in the case of North Korea, there's no comparable samizdat network, although some North Koreans courageously do get information out. Nor would anyone be able to set up a human rights NGO given the excessive controls over the population. But today's internet, advanced communication technology, satellite-based technology, and AI create opportunities for reaching North Koreans, especially the elite and North Koreans working, studying, or doing business outside the country. A coordinated information strategy and campaign reinforced by resources and tech company skills is sorely needed. Third, a focus on individual Soviet political prisoners was effective in mobilizing world opinion and sometimes gaining reduced sentences and their release. In his Nobel lecture, Sakharov set forth the names of at least 100 internally exiled or imprisoned people. Now, I don't think there's any other Nobel Peace lecture that has names of prisoners in it, about 100. And when he was released from internal exile, what did he give to Gorbachev? the names of people held on political grounds who should be released, and most, if not all, were. Some were members of this Moscow committee who had been arrested or internally exiled, and we managed to get one out of the country. And then to preserve the memory of those who perished in Stalin's labor camps and prisons, Sakharov founded the NGO Memorial. As regards North Korea, there's been progress on the part of the UN, NGOs, the South Korean government, over the past 2 decades in bringing to light the atrocity of the camps, and by taking testimony from the victims who survived. But in my opinion, more attention needs to be focused on the individuals still in the prisons, so that they do not remain nameless and faceless. Now, it's true that the Soviet cases were often dissidents and well known in their professional fields. And that's not the case in North Korea, where there's no space for dissidents. But I welcome civil society's and the Ministry of Unification's efforts to put a spotlight on individual cases. There are the 6 South Koreans in prison that are being now given some spotlight. Should diplomatic negotiations be held with North Korea in future, cases should be raised. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the DPRK in 2021 proposed an international conference on prisons in North Korea. Why not revisit this idea? Because as we speak, tens of thousands of people are imprisoned on political and religious grounds, and they're suffering from hunger, lack of medicines, forced labor, and brutal treatment. Fourth, I learned that it's important to counter the intimidation and harassment to which foreign human rights NGOs have been subjected that provide information about the Soviet Union's or North Korea's human rights records. On the days that the International League in the 1970s used to call the Moscow Committee, Russian visitors sometimes arrived at my office to intimidate. One KGB agent told me that we were wasting our time. No one in the Soviet Union knew about Sakharov and Chalitzer. They were nobodies. So I asked him, so why are you here? And I began to laugh, actually. Other times, Russian UN staff members, people who worked in the UN, but were of Russian origin, citizenship, and in the UN Human Rights Office in New York, they would telephone on the days of the calls to demand information about the League or tell me a UN official wanted to see me. Once I went over to the UN office to confront them, but they pretended not to recall. North Korea today has its own modus operandi. It regularly tries to hack into our phones, our computers, sends us false messages, seeking to interfere with our work. In addition, the Soviet Union, and today North Korea through Russia and China, interferes with NGO access to the UN. Beginning in 1969, the Soviet Union publicly warned NGOs that they could be expelled from consultative status at the UN if they engaged in unsubstantiated and politically motivated attacks against socialist countries. The Soviet Union was a member of the UN's NGO committee, which decides on which NGOs get consultative status at the UN. I once had to appear before that committee to defend my organization and was questioned for 2 hours with the Soviet delegate who sat right near me, banging his fist on the table and not being called to order by the chair. But I got the vote. In more recent years, HRNK, which exposes the human rights situation in North Korea, was blocked by Russia and China and others from gaining consultative status. It is this same UN NGO committee. But with US help, the committee's parent body, the UN Economic and Social Council, overrode the committee's rejection and awarded HRNK UN status. But NGOs dedicated to the human rights situation in North Korea should not have to struggle to gain entry to the UN, especially when the UN Commission of Inquiry found that North Korea is regularly committing crimes against humanity against its population, and the UN General Assembly has reaffirmed this. A well-publicized expose of this committee's composition and political biases is in order. A final point, when change does occur in a dictatorship, extensive planning is needed for the day after to assure that a more open and democratic society develops. Beginning in 1989, with Gorbachev in power in the Soviet Union, Sakharov was released from exile, reinstated in the Academy of Sciences, elected to the first Congress of People's Deputies, and became a member of the commission drafting a new constitution. But Sakharov warned at the time that despite glasnost and perestroika, the opening up of the Soviet Union, guarantees were needed against unchecked concentration of power. And we see Vladimir Putin today stifling political opposition, recreating political prisons, killing Alexei Navalny, who said that they're afraid of what we say, closing down Memorial, and we should be grateful to the German government because in Germany, Memorial is being created, the very one that the Soviet Union closed that Sakharov had founded. And Putin has also been weakening ties between human rights troops in Russia and overseas. Is there something to be learned pertinent to North Korea? Yes. As has been said before me, the Kim family dictatorship will come to an end. But efforts should be developed and strengthened now to bring defectors and escapees together to work out how best to create a democratic society in the North. According to Andrei Sakharov, no exertions are too great, however long the road may seem. Thank you.
Roberta, thank you very much. Ambassador King, you're up next, sir.
Thanks very much, Greg. In some ways, I kind of feel like Forrest Gump. But I want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that I've been involved with as we think about the connection in terms of the fall of the wall and what's going on currently in North Korea. When I was an undergraduate, the university I attended established a study abroad program, and I was one of the students that was involved in the first study abroad program that they did. We were in Salzburg, Austria, and this was 1965. This was 10 years after Austria became an independent country again at the end of World War II. And we were there for the celebration of the Austrian Staatsvertrag, the treaty which established Austria as an independent, separate country. One of the things that we found is that there were a lot of interesting things close by. I convinced the political science professor who was there that we ought to go to Hungary and see a celebration coming up. So we arranged for a bus to take us from Salzburg to Budapest. We were there on the 4th of April, 1965, which was the 20th anniversary of the last German soldier being driven out of Hungarian territory. We were there at the large area where they have military parades, and this was a military parade. The thing that was interesting is right across from where we were looking was the podium on which the statue of Stalin stood that had been torn down during the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. But there on that occasion, Anastas Mikoyan was representing the Soviet Union. We had a Russian cosmonaut, female cosmonaut, who was there on that occasion. And it was a very interesting event to see that going on at the time. A month later, we did a trip to Prague. We happened to be in Prague on May Day. We marched down Wenceslas Square. Everybody, a May Day parade is not a parade that you go to watch. It's a parade that you go to be in. And so we all picked up pom-poms with the Czech colors, which happened to be red, white, and blue in honor of the connection between Czechoslovakia and the United States. And we marched down and waved at Novotny, who was the president of the country as well as the leader of the Communist Party. 3 years later, he was thrown out of office as Prague fell apart, and shortly thereafter was occupied by Russian troops. I decided, based on my experience, that I was going to change my major from going into law and becoming a potential candidate for Congress in Wyoming and do something about international affairs. And what I began doing, what I did is complete my degree in political science, went to Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where Greg is also one of the distinguished graduates of that institution. While I was at Fletcher, I did my doctoral thesis on ethnicity and identity in Central Europe. And it was interesting enough that Harvard University published it, and it's available. The only problem is it's badly out of date. Shortly after I finished it, the world changed again, but it's interesting from a historical point of view. When I was finished my PhD, one of the sources of information that have been particularly important were the reports that were done by Radio Free Europe on what was happening in Central Europe. And I was offered a job and the opportunity to go to Munich, spend time looking at countries that were dealing with problems in Central Europe was too interesting to pass up. After 7 years, I received a White House fellowship and came back to Washington. I was in the Carter administration. One of my first responsibilities was to deal with the president's visit to Poland. And Jimmy Carter, first foreign overseas trip was to Poland. It was of interest because Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the advisor, the national security advisor, happens to be Polish, but it was a very interesting time to be in Poland. We went there while I was the official note taker for the meetings between President Carter and Edward Gierek, who was the leader of Poland at the time. At the state dinner that was held the night we were there, I sat next to the Polish defense minister, whose name was Jaruzelski. He became the president of Poland, the leader of the Communist Party, and was one who ended up surviving his tenure, but only after he was removed. When we finished the Polish trip, Carter went on to India and other places. I went to Budapest. The United States had made the decision to return the Hungarian crown of St. Stephen to the Hungarian government. We had negotiated the conditions for the return and so forth, and Secretary of State Cyrus Vance was there to make the presentation. So I was there, I was a member of the official delegation in the Budapest Parliament building, modeled on the U.S. Capitol, and there is a dome in the center, a House of Parliament on each side, but also on the British Parliament because it's in the style of the Gothic revival. We finished that. I went back to Washington, did various other things related to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. My next job of interest was Chief of Staff to Congressman Tom Lantos, Hungarian American, as Greg mentioned, the only Holocaust survivor elected to Congress. We got along very well. I happened to meet his daughter and son-in-law at a job I had in Colorado after I came back. And they introduced me to Tom Lantos because they thought he needed a new chief of staff, and they thought I would be the right one. I accepted the job, and after I accepted the job, I told Tom that I'd been involved in the return of the crown, and I met Ceausescu, who was one of the people that we had an interest in as well. While I was with Tom Lantos in 1989, he had decided he was going to go on a trip to Central Europe because of things that were happening at that time. This was the time that things were beginning to fall apart in Central Europe. We arrived in Berlin 1 month to the day after the gates were opened on the Berlin Wall. One of the things that we did, the embassy people there knew what to do, is we went to the wall. And they were well equipped because they provided us with the equipment we needed to chip our own piece of the walls. And I'd like to show you a piece of the Berlin Wall. This is from the Berlin Wall. I carved it out myself. Not artistic, but it has some significance. We spent, you may touch it. Having a piece of the Berlin Wall made me feel very close to what was going on, to the events that were there. We met with officials as the East German government was imploding. There was no longer a communist government. There was a government that was composed of the Peasant Party officials who were in coalition with the communists. The Peasant Party people were peasants. They were people who did what they were told, and suddenly they were in charge. We met with them. We were there in Berlin when the last meeting of the four powers occupying Germany and occupying Berlin had their final meeting. The Russians were concerned about what was going on. There hadn't been a meeting of the four powers in Berlin for 20 years. And the Russians said, we've got to have a meeting. And Jim Baker was there. And we were there at the time the meeting took place. They invited us in. I can't imagine why. But the meeting took place while we were there. From Berlin, we went to Warsaw. The Polish parliament was in chaos. There had been a free, fair, and open election, and the upper house of the Polish parliament, Polish Sejm, there were elections, and they were relatively free elections. This was one of the things that was happening at that time. There were 100 members of the upper house. 99 were solidarity candidates. 1 was a communist candidate. The Hungarians were shocked. The communists in Poland were shocked at what was going on. We had an opportunity to meet some of the officials while we were there. We were only there for a day or two. We went to Prague. In Prague, things had started to fall apart, and this is something that had happened 1 week before. We had a meeting scheduled with the foreign minister, the new foreign minister of Czechoslovakia. He was late for the meeting because his previous job a week earlier had been as the caretaker of an apartment house in Prague. And the apartment had run out of coal, and he had to stay there and make sure that the coal got put in the bin so that they could have heat in the apartment building. The conversation was a remarkable one. That night, we went to an opera performance at the Prague Opera House. And as we were going there, students were standing out on the street shouting, Havel na Prague, Havel to the castle. They wanted Havel to be appointed the president. It was a remarkable occasion. From there, we went to Budapest. Budapest was in a state of suspended animation because they were going to have a new election. They didn't have a functioning party. We met with the Communist Party officials who were apprehensive about what was going to happen when the election took place. That evening, we had dinner with the charge, the person, the American embassy ambassador wasn't there. It was the charge who invited us. Was the man who became the next prime minister of Hungary. The next morning, we left to go back to the United States. As we were getting into the car, cab to head to the airport, he said, by the way, there were some interesting things that were going on in Romania last night. Hungarians pay particular attention to the western parts of Romania because there's a significant Hungarian population there. A Hungarian preacher by the name of Laszlo Turkish was minister of a Calvinist church. The Romanian guards had come to haul him away and put him in prison for what he had been saying, and the church had been surrounded by citizens. This is Romania, where everybody knew that Ceausescu would order the pulling of the trigger if necessary. The Romanians protested, the troops backed off, Laszlo Turkish survived, and a week later, 25th of December, 89, Nicolae Ceausescu was executed by his military force. As I say, I felt very much like Forrest Gump in terms of being there on that particular occasion. It was remarkable to see the events that took place as we went through that event. In December of '89, when we were in in Berlin, one of the things that we did is watch as we went to Potsdamer Platz. Potsdamer Platz was one of the most important spots in Berlin. It was divided by the wall and became basically a no man's land. That night, as we were out there, and it was about 8 or 9 o'clock at night, lights everywhere, cranes began the process of tearing down the wall. And we watched as these concrete panels were pulled up and removed and replaced. It was a remarkable experience to see these events happen and to see them taking place over the 20, 30 years that I was involved in dealing with those problems. As we look at what happened in Central Europe, the real question is, what does that say about North Korea? Does it say anything about North Korea? Are we in the same situation? Is this something that could happen as well? And what might it take to do? There are probably some differences, significant differences between Central Europe and what was going on, their relationship particularly with the Soviet Union, and what is happening in North Korea right now. Part of the problem is that the conditions were very different. Communism was imposed on the countries of Central Europe. There were local communists, but the local communists were not the ones that were running the show. Moscow was in charge. In South Korea, it's much more a case of the local communist leaders being the ones that were in charge. And yes, they were heavily dependent on Moscow, they were heavily dependent on on Beijing. But at the same time, it's not as easy, it's not rising up against the foreigners. And there are certain questions about what does that mean, where do we go from here? The one thing that I think is important is looking at information. I mentioned my time with Radio Free Europe. Radio Free Europe was a very important part of what was going on in Central Europe. There was access to information. People did know to some extent what was going on. There were efforts, limits in terms of how much information was available. But in South Korea, North Korea, it is a much more difficult kind of problem. It's much more difficult to get information in for several reasons. One, and probably the most important one, is that the North Korean government is so intent on controlling information that they are far more in control than what was the case in the countries of Central Europe. For example, in Hungary and in Romania, Radio Free Europe was not jammed. It was helpful to the local regime to hear the radios talking about what was happening, what the government was doing, and how it was causing problems for the Russians. In North Korea, it is an absolute jam. They do not want people to listen, and listening to foreign radio in South Korea is far more difficult, and far more complicated, and far more deadly. The stories about one woman who was a night guard at one of the factories in Pyongyang. She listened to radio, one of the American broadcasts, Korean broadcasts, and she left the radio tuned to that channel. They found out the next day, and she was executed. This is far more draconian than the kind of problems that were taking place in Central Europe at the time. On the other hand, access to information is still an important part of what's going on in North Korea. There is broadcasting. It is important. People do take the risk to find out what's going on, to listen. Because of the changes, there are other ways of getting information, and that's happening and that's taking place. I've spoken way too long. I've gone way over, haven't I? I'm sorry about that.
It's just delightful,
But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that information does make a difference. It does change people's minds. It does change attitudes. It does cause people to be more critical of their government. And I think it's important that we need to continue the effort to provide information, to see that information goes into North Korea and into other areas like that. Greg, thank you very much for being so indulgent.
Thank you very much. We'll take two quick questions, if you have any, before we make the transition to the next panel. Any questions?
Thanks so much for inspirational insights and life stories. I'm Justin. I'm a student at Georgetown University. And my question is, so you've made connections with Eastern Europe and North Korea. And I see that connection growing with North Korean involvement in the Russian-Ukraine war currently. How do you think that would impact perhaps domestic perceptions within North Korea towards the regime, or is there any implications that growing ties between the two regions would have globally?
And may I please ask you to whom you're directing the question? That's the case. Well, I think I'll talk a little bit about this very briefly during the second panel as I introduce the panel. We talked to a lot of members of the European Parliament. I had a meeting this morning, virtual, a meeting yesterday morning. They're getting very serious about it. The EU has been very good about talking about human rights, humanitarian assistance, the security challenges. Right now, they're not talking about the North Korean challenge arriving on the doorstep of Europe. They're talking about the North Korean proliferation of instability and violence threatening Europe very directly, because all EU member states regard Ukraine as a European state. So this is very present and clear danger. Everybody's waking up. Things are very serious. We'll talk about it during panel 2 as well. Thank you for the question, Mr. King.
One additional comment. It's not clear what's happening with these North Korean troops. There are some stories that have appeared which suggest that the North Korean troops are being integrated with Russian troops. And that would create some fairly serious problems because you don't have a common language. There are suggestions that the Russian troops are just ignoring the North Koreans who are there because they don't understand what's going on. And when the Russian troops choose to withdraw, if the North Koreans are left behind, they don't worry about them. I can see the potential for some real problems on the front lines when you've got two very different language groups and two very differently trained groups. I can imagine that there may be problems from this for the North Korean leader. If there are a lot of North Korean troops who are killed, there are going to be people who are very unhappy about what this might mean. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of that. For Kim Jong-un, it makes sense. For people who live in North Korea, having their husband die in battle like that isn't going to be terribly encouraging.
I'm going to just ask one question. Does anybody have any information on whether North Korean troops, or how many, I heard a number of 18, have defected and asked for asylum?
We're not sure about that. We do have some reports, but those mayors, they're certainly, so as Dave Max will tell us, they belong to the 11th Corps Light Infantry Special Forces, best trained, best equipped, best indoctrinated, jump trained, small arms training, fully compatible with the Russians. Of course, you're under artillery fire, people do desert, they do defect, they get scared. But if we see massive desertions, massive defections, that may spell serious trouble for the Kim Jong-un regime. These are the troops least likely to defect, I would say. But then again, we'll defer to Dave during the next panel. I don't think these reports have been confirmed yet, Roberto. We've definitely heard them, yes. Well, thank you so much. Let's take a 2-minute break. Please refill your cup of coffee, have some cookies, and let's make the transition to the next panel. Ambassador King, co-chair Roberta Cohen, thank you so much. This was such a treat. I've been dreaming about doing this. Let's do it again. Thank you. National Affairs at George Washington University, right down the street, fortunately. Author of major books on the Berlin Wall, the fall of Berlin Wall, the prize-winning Driving the Soviets Up the Wall, Soviet-East German Relations, 1953-1961, After the Berlin Wall, Memory and the Making of the New Germany, 1989 to the present, and the Berlin Wall, A World Divided. Again, one of America's top scholars, in particular of this issue. Hope, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's an honor to be here. So I'm going to talk about two aspects of the relevance of the experience of Germany for Korea. I'm going to talk about first what led to German unification, and is any part of that process relevant to Korea? And then I'm going to talk about what's happened in the nearly 35 years since Germany united, and are there lessons from that for Korea. First, let me say that South Korea, the Ministry of Unification, has brought to Seoul pretty much every important German politician who had anything to do with unification to try to figure out how they could learn from that. As one of them, Lothar de Maizière, said on his 5th trip to South Korea since unification, said, "This is now my 4th or 5th Korean unification minister. They appoint new ones all the time. I can't remember all their names. And they always have the same questions. The Koreans basically don't want unity to cost too much." I'm happy to follow, although I'm an American, and a long line of Germans that have spoken about this issue. So, what led to German unification? I'm going to mention 6 points here. The first is the role of West Germany. So in this case, it would be, what role can South Korea play right now? So West Germany started a policy of Ostpolitik, reaching out to the East in the late 1960s, and basically continued it thereafter. Establishing relations, having trade ties, all sorts of things. There's still debates in Germany now, 35 years after all of this, as to what was the most important factors that led to German unification. But one of them is certainly West Germany reaching out to the East and opening up more movement across the border between East and West Germany. Now, the media has been raised several times here and how important that was. That was essential in Germany. The majority of East Germans, certainly by the 1980s, but even in the 1970s, were getting Western broadcasts and West German broadcasts, whether it be TV or radio, so they were really aware of what was on the other side of the militarized border. Another thing West Germany did as part of all of this is from the start, it said any ethnic German who comes to West Germany will get German citizenship. And that, of course, included people who escaped from East Germany, very quickly getting West German citizenship. So many of those things, the media, the cross-border movement, of course, is not what we see in Korea. The second part of what led to German unification is the role of East Germany's communist allies. So in this case, of course, the question is, particularly China, what China's view of a changing regime in North Korea be, and Russia to a lesser extent. But the role of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev's reforms in the late 1980s were absolutely crucial to the process in East Germany and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Reforming communism, making it clear he was not going to intervene in communist countries in Eastern Europe, that those days were over of sending in the tanks and the troops to put down uprisings. They weren't going to do that. So that obviously, gave people more of a sense of freedom and a chance to resist. The neighbors were incredibly important for East Germany. What happened in Poland in 1989, Poland starting roundtable talks between the government and the opposition at the beginning of 1989, 9 months before the wall came down. Hungary opening its barbed wire border with Austria in May of 1989, again, long before the wall came down. So, seeing East German citizens learning about these things and following people in escaping, or as they would say, going on vacation to Hungary, where they would then cross over into Austria and then make their way back up to West Germany and get citizenship. So these factors, the Soviet Union and Poland and Hungary, reforms, changes, opening borders around East Germany played a very important role. Again, there's nothing really like that to expect with North Korea. What about the role of the East German people? Well, they played two roles in 1989, 35 years ago. On the one hand, as reforms were made and borders were opening a bit more, especially from Hungary to Austria, people started escaping. I mean, thousands and thousands of people would camp out at West German embassies in Prague and Budapest and elsewhere, Warsaw especially, and make their way eventually to West Germany. But other East Germans were increasingly emboldened to say, we're staying here. We do not want to leave. We want change in our country. And so the combination of pressure on the regime from countries around it, from its own citizens leaving, from its own citizens taking to the street, all of this was very important. But nothing might have actually happened 35 years ago in Berlin if it hadn't been for chance. Because the Berlin Wall was not supposed to open. That was not the plan at all. It was a mistake. I always tell my students, this shows the importance of being prepared when you speak in public. Because the press spokesman, Günter Schabowski, who was having an international press conference on the night of November 9th, wasn't at the key leadership meetings that day. At the last minute, he got the notes from one of the leaders, and at the very end of a long press conference where the world was wondering what's happening in East Germany with all this pressure on it, and the government, many people had been resigned, everything was changing, there were a lot of things to talk about. So he waited till the last minute and, oh yeah, by the way, we have a new draft travel regulation. Since you were not allowed, as in any communist country, you were not allowed without permission, without a visa to travel to the West. And he said, actually, now all borders will be open. You can travel to the West. And, a reporter asked, what about the Berlin Wall? And he looked down in a really confused way at his notes, like trying to find the answer, and ends up saying, yeah, Berlin too, and any place, immediately it's open, which was not true. He totally misunderstood, but the media went with it. And so East Germans could see it on their TV, West Germans and East Germans are watching East German TV and West German TV, and over the next several hours, they start going to the border. And the guys there don't have any orders, and finally give in and let the people go through. So it was chance. And it wasn't just chance, it was also the location of Berlin. And there's no similar massive population center that straddles the border, the DMZ, between North Korea and South Korea. There just isn't that geography there. In the case of Berlin, all of Berlin was 110 miles inside of communist East Germany. So West Berlin, which was democratic, capitalist-free, etc., was surrounded by communist East Germany. So when the border opened, people immediately could be in West Berlin. And the East German regime never really got the genie back in the bottle after that. They tried, but they just couldn't. And a few months later, they had their first and last free elections, where the East German people voted. They basically had a choice of two different paths to unification. A rapid path whereby essentially they would be absorbed into West Germany, and just the West German constitution would now cover a bigger area. Or they could go a slower way and have a constitutional convention with representatives from East Germany and West Germany getting together and deciding what would the new Germany be like. And the East German people had had enough and said, you know, we want what they have. We want that now. And so that's what happened. My second set of remarks is what has happened in Germany since unification. And Germany was united less than a year after the wall fell in a very carefully controlled domestic and international process of the US, Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France, and the two parts of Germany. So, 5 points about what's happened since then and the relevance for Korea. While most Germans, including from the East, are happy that the country is united and think their lives are generally better, there have been some big challenges. And there is, in fact, increasing talk about lingering division in the country even 35 years later. And this is very visible in how people vote. So, 5 points about this. Number 1, Germany invested over 2 trillion euros into the eastern part of the country to bring it up to Western standards. It would be presumably far more money to do that in North Korea, which is not as developed as East Germany is. To do this, Germany levied a tax, a solidarity tax on everyone that was first 7.5% and then was reduced to 5.5% of all income. So, a lot of money. Number 2, there was a political decision made about how to unite the currency. Obviously, the East German currency was nowhere near as powerful as the West German Deutschmark. But politically, to make them feel as equals, the decision was made, we'll do a currency union on a 1-to-1 basis. So politically that made sense, but ultimately it had very bad economic repercussions because East German industry overnight became non-competitive since they had to pay salaries at a Western rate that did not match the goods that were being produced or the productivity in the East. 35 years later, salaries, wages, productivity, etc., haven't fully reached Western levels. They've gotten much better over the 35 years, but still haven't reached Western levels. And in the initial years, in like the first, after 10 years, there was massive unemployment in the East, 18% unemployment in the East. 2 final points. In the period after unification, many East Germans kept moving west, even though it was one country. And especially women did that. They felt there were better opportunities in the West. So that has led to some ghost towns in the East. And finally, as one former East German leader said on a trip to Seoul, I've realized that the South Koreans are trying to figure out a way for the North Koreans to remain in the North after unification. That didn't work in Germany. We don't know if it would work there. And the final point is a psychological point. Many in the East, which has fueled the rise of the conservative far-right, really anti-establishment protest party in the East, feel that they were colonized, feel that they've been treated as second-class citizens. There's a talk that there's still sort of a certain kind of wall in the mind, even though the actual wall fell 35 years ago. So the lessons from the process of Germany are that, it's not necessarily, a lot of that is not necessarily relevant to Korea, especially since North Korea has nuclear weapons, obviously, because Germany didn't. And that it's been a challenging process and would certainly be very, very expensive. So my understanding is that the Ministry of Unification has become a little bit less inspired by the German example and, more a bit worried about the lessons from the German example. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Some very important lessons, a lot of them, in particular, the fact that this is not only unification of territory, but a unification of the people of South and North Korea. Of course, we get the argument about the North being rich in subsoil resources, having qualified and cheap labor, and the South having capital and know-how. But it's about much more than just that. It's a unification of the people. Also, a very important point you made, I think, is opportunity. If you see the opportunity, take it, because that's how unification happens. And remember, if you're talking about German unification, you're also talking about the 19th century, right? Post-Congress of Vienna, post-1815, the first political unification of German states, then the Zollverein, the customs union, the economic unification of the German states. I think we can learn from all of these precedents. I don't mean to go back to Romania, but 1859, unification of Wallachia and Moldova. They went down to the peasants, the very simple people who bought into the idea of unification. Again, unification is about the people first, territory second. Thank you, Dr. Harrison. This was terrific. We're now going to move on to Colonel David Maxwell, who's a member of the board of directors of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, also vice president of the Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy, scholar, warrior, great American patriot. Dave retired as a U.S. Army Special Forces colonel, spent more than 3 decades in the Asia-Pacific region. Dave continues to be a great proponent of Korean unification. We need to hear his arguments over and over again. We must stay committed to unification, and there's nobody better than Dave to make this argument. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Greg, and it's really daunting to follow 4 great presentations and as a historian, I think you could hear the best history is told through stories, and your storytelling was brilliant. And we've heard diplomats, government officials, scholars, someone who's lived through it firsthand. I'm going to give you a little bit of a military perspective since that's my background. And I was in Germany, in Schweinfurt, Germany, from 1983 to 1985, and we were very worried about the Warsaw Pact attacking NATO. To us, the Soviet Union, the East Germans, the Czechs, the Warsaw Pact, they were 10 feet tall, and we were preparing for the defense. And frankly, I didn't see it coming. Of course, I take some solace. I don't think anybody saw the Berlin Wall coming. So, I think that's the first point. But I got to observe the inter-German border between East and West Germany, the Czech border with West Germany, and really conduct military planning for the defense of West Germany and Western Europe. I left Germany in 1985 and I went to Korea. And I spent 1986 to 1988 on the DMZ in Korea, another divided country. And so I got to see that firsthand. And back then, the American sector got to patrol the DMZ and do all of those things while preparing for the defense of South Korea, because we were very worried about the invasion of the South by the North, resuming the temporarily suspended hostilities by the armistice at some point. And so I left Korea in 1988, and I went to special forces training, and then I returned back to Korea in 1989. And I was conducting training with our South Korean Special Forces on November 9th, 1989, when we got word, back then, of course, no internet, no anything, our communications sergeant would get on our radios, on AM HF radios, and they would tap into the ham radios to get the news, and that's how we found out that the wall had fallen. And so here we are, Americans and South Koreans, and thinking now, the wall fell, communism is over. What's going to happen in Korea? And that was really a wake-up call for me after spending a few years in Korea. And then, of course, things evolved. The wall came down, Soviet Union fell, but then, of course, the nuclear problem rose in North Korea. And as it continued to serve in Korea, and of course, 1994 was a bad year. We really thought we were going to war with North Korea. And so all of our focus was still on, war fighting, the nuclear threat. But what happened, of course, we all know about the famine, the arduous march, 94 to 96. And so, Jimmy Carter, Kim Il-sung, and Kim Jong-il, we had the agreed framework in 94. We all know how that turned out. We all know how agreements with the Kim family regime turned out. But, the guns of war were subsided somewhat in 94. I went to school from 94 to 96 at Fort Leavenworth. And while I was at the School of Advanced Military Studies, I wrote a monograph on the catastrophic collapse of North Korea. I was inspired by the fall of the wall and the fall of communism, and my service in Korea made me worried about something happening in Korea. And so I was influenced by Elliot Cohen and John Gooch, who wrote a book called Military Misfortunes. So all military failures are the result of three things: the failure to learn, the failure to adapt, and the failure to anticipate. We've learned a lot, and we have really learned a lot from what's happened. I think we've adapted some, but we've certainly learned a lot what happened in Germany and the entire fall of communism. But the key thing is anticipating, and anticipation is really hard. I was worried that North Korea was going to collapse, so I wrote a monograph and I looked at all the issues, and it really became the basis for, when I returned back to Korea in 1996, the basis for our planning for the catastrophic collapse of North Korea. And I went to work with a close friend and one of the major researchers here for HRNK, Robert Collins, who had just finished writing his thesis on the 7 phases of North Korean collapse. And we worked for a board member for HRNK now, General John Tillella, and who was the commander in Korea. And Secretary of Defense Cohen told us to plan for the collapse of North Korea. And so we did. And we wrote Con Plan 5029, and we were really worried. Now, in our defense, because I get criticized for being a collapsist all the time, in our defense, we never predicted when North Korea would collapse. Our only prediction was, if it does, it will be catastrophic, and we need to be ready. However, the nuclear issues and the continued threats have really caused an ongoing paralysis, what I call a strategic planning paralysis. And that has affected unification planning. And of course, in 1997, with the election of Kim Dae-jung and the Sunshine Policy, I think the Sunshine Policy prevented the collapse of North Korea. The infusion of resources from the South really saved the Kim family regime. But the people continued to suffer. The public distribution system failed, but what saved the people was not the money from the South, it was the growth of markets. It was the resiliency of the Korean people in the North, particularly women, who really created the black markets. And to this day, there are some 400 markets in the North, which are really, as I said, have really given the Korean people, the 25 million Korean people, some resiliency to deal with the hardships. Now, things are changing now because post-COVID and the internal threats, Kim Jong-un is cracking down on those markets. But however, that is really, I think, what saved the people. So we have been myopically focused on the nuclear program, particularly the United States. And we've tried multiple efforts, in 94, 2005, 2009, the Leap Day Agreement. We've had strategic patience, we've had maximum pressure, and we've, of course, had, Trump and Kim meeting, and nothing has worked. And we continue to focus on the nuclear weapons. Well, I will give you my thesis right now. And what it is that we need to turn the conventional wisdom on its head. Most people think that we must first denuclearize and then unification can occur. It is my belief the only way we're going to see an end to the nuclear threats, the military threats, the crimes against humanity is through unification, the establishment of a secure, stable, non-nuclear, economically vibrant, unified Korea that's under a constitutional form of government determined by the Korean people based on freedom, individual liberty, free market economy, human rights, the rule of law, and determined by the Korean people. And I believe that really needs to be our goal. And I say it needs to be South Korean goal, and we as allies of South Korea, the Republic of Korea, we should support that goal. Now, I want to make the point that right now, I believe we're at an inflection point. And I actually believe, and don't take this out of context, but it almost appears that President Yoon and Kim Jong-un are coordinating their efforts. And you might think that's funny, and I want to get a laugh, so thank you for that. But I say that because 2024 has been a year of great change in the North and South. The first change, of course, is Kim Jong-un is under tremendous internal stress. And when the regime is under stress, they must externalize the threat. And so Kim Jong-un has declared the South the main enemy, and has removed peaceful unification from the objective of Korea. Now, they've taken away peaceful unification. He has not removed, the words in their constitution about continuing and completing the revolution, removing foreign elements from the peninsula. Kim Jong-un still seeks domination. And the strategy of the Kim family regime of political warfare, blackmail diplomacy, and development of advanced military capabilities to ultimately dominate the peninsula has not stopped. But Kim Jong-un is reacting to what's going on in many events, including here at HRNK before she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. She always asks the question, who is Kim Jong-un more afraid of, the United States military or the Korean people in the North? And the answer is the Korean people in the North, particularly when armed with information about the South. What is the real existential threat to Kim Jong-un, the Kim family regime? It is the example of the South. It's the existence of the South. It is there that is a better life. Now, Kim Jong-un has taken away the hope of peaceful unification from the Korean people in the North. And this has confused them. We have seen, the reports now, monthly indoctrination sessions are now being conducted down at the middle school level weekly, to explain why there's no more unification, why South Korea is the main enemy. Kim Jong-un is very afraid of what's going on inside. Now, this is really important, and from our collapse work and everything, we look at, and people ask, how do you define the collapse of the regime? And it really, we study this hard, and Bob Collins has done tremendous work on this, but it really comes down to two conditions. When the Korean Workers' Party, the Communist Party, the Kim family regime no longer has the ability to govern from Pyongyang, that is when they are no longer able to govern the entire territory. That will be the loss of central governing effectiveness. Combined with the second condition, which is the loss of coherency of the military and the loss of support of the military for the regime. Those are the two key conditions that could lead to the collapse of the regime. Now, can we see that coming? Do we know when it's going to occur? No, we don't. But we must look hard for the indicators. Now, the third thing that Kim Jong-un has done this year, of course, is sent forces to support Putin's war in Ukraine. And, you know, from the previous questions, Kim Jong-un knows what a danger that is to him, because one of the things that he has done, according to reports, is taken the families of the soldiers and isolated them. And I think that is really an attempt to prevent, you know, when North Korean People's Army soldiers come back in body bags, or worse, don't come back at all. That is, they are attempting to prevent the flow of information from those families to the outside, to the rest of Korea. Now, I don't think they'll be able to prevent that, but you can see and recognize the threat of that Kim Jong-un sees in his own actions. And of course, he's gambling. You know that he's going to get money from Putin. He's going to get advanced technology from Putin. Even the people say that they're going to get food and help from Putin. Some of the reports we hear from Radio Free Asia, you know, say that there is some support for this because they think they will benefit as Kim Jong-un, you know, sends his mercenary-like force, you know, rents it out to Putin. But the other point here is that when the North Korean People's Army is defeated soundly by the Ukrainian forces, that's going to send a powerful message to the rest of the North Korean People's Army. If we exploit that, if South Korea exploits that, if the U.S. Exploits that information going into the North. And this is really key. And I want to just, you know, talk about it in terms of collapse, but something that, that Professor Harrison said and Greg experienced, how important the militaries are to authoritarian regimes. And there are two messages we want to send to the North Korean People's Army from a psychological warfare, psychological operations perspective. We want the North Korean People's Army to make two decisions. One is, do not obey the order to attack South Korea. We want to prevent war. And the other one is, do not obey the order to suppress resistance among the population. You know, we can see when the military, you know, opens the checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, you know, when the Romanian army lays down its guns, then the people survive and things change. So we want to use the defeat of the North Korean People's Army in Putin's war in Ukraine. We want to use that information and build on that for the rest of the North Korean People's Army. Now, I would, as I mentioned, we have a strategic planning paralysis, planning for unification. The other thing that's happened in 2024 is President Yoon has given us the 815 Unification Doctrine. From my experience, this is the most comprehensive unification planning that I've ever seen in South Korea. I think most other planning, both on the North and South, have really been hand waves, you know, one country, two systems, confederation. But President Yoon and the Ministry of Unification have laid out a comprehensive plan, still broad and still a lot of work to be done, but it is more substantive than anything I've seen in the past. And so this is why I say that Kim Jong-un and President Yoon are working together. Kim Jong-un is creating the conditions for his own collapse, and President Yoon is really providing a substantive plan to deal with the future, and you know, one that we must support. Now, everybody, when we say planning for unification, most people think about planning to negotiate a peaceful settlement. And you know, that is really unlikely to occur because Kim Jong-un is not going to acquiesce. However, what South Korea is doing is planning for unification. It's not a negotiation, it's not getting Kim Jong-un to give up and peacefully unify. Peaceful unification is the goal, and one we must all support. But planning for peaceful unification is the most comprehensive and difficult and complex planning that must be conducted. The integration of two systems, two economies, two political systems, two militaries, really two divergent cultures, you know, for the last 70 years. All of that must be planned for, the integration. And things have to occur. Policies must be established. And how do you keep Korean people in the North to stay in the North? Maybe it's through land ownership. When I talk to the Korean diaspora, which I like to use that term instead of defectors and escapees, the North Korean diaspora, those come from North Korea, they still want to go home. All of us want to go home. We all want to go back to where we came from. And I think that if given the opportunity, Koreans from the North, might want to stay in the North if they own their land, if they own their houses, and of course, if they're given economic opportunities to not only survive, but thrive. And so it is this planning for peaceful unification that is really, really important. And we must think about, how South Korea must conduct this planning and integrate all of its agencies, and then, of course, get international support for a unified, free and unified Korea. Because the international community can play a big role. And I would defer to another of our board members, Dr. Nicholas Heberstadt, who's done some incredible work on looking at the potential for economic growth in a unified Korea. We are scared of the German model. I think in Korea, I think they invited everybody from Germany there. I think probably more Koreans have gotten PhD dissertations on German unification than any other subject. But the costs scare people. But I think that economists, business people, there are tremendous opportunities in a free and unified Korea. And we must seek those out and support all the Korean people in doing that. Let me just close with this this point. People in North and South are different, but a Korean friend of mine told me that there's 2 miracles in Korea. And the first one we all know is the miracle on the Han, how Korea rose from the ashes of the war, and the only OECD nation to go from major aid recipient to major donor nation. We have the Korean wave. Politically, economically, culturally, Korea is a country that punches well above its weight. 10th largest economy in the world. And so it has really, really thrived because of the opportunities it's been given. Now, I said, well, what is the other miracle? And he said, that's the miracle on the Tano. And I said, what miracle is that? And he said, the fact is that after 70 years, the Korean people in the North continue to survive under horrendous conditions. And the worst conditions, as the UN Commission of Inquiry 2014 describes for us, the worst crimes against humanity since the Second World War. But the people survived, and they survived the arduous march. And his point to me was that despite the differences between North and South, the spirit of Korea, the spirit of the Han, exists within Koreans on both sides of the DMZ. And that is that when faced with hardship, Koreans survive. When given opportunities, Koreans will thrive. And I listen to that, I look at that, and I see that example. And even in the North, as closed and oppressed as it is, we see Koreans thrive in the black market, the gray market, the markets. People understand entrepreneurial, and how to be entrepreneurs. And that is what has given them the resilience to survive. And the last thing I'll say is Radio Free Asia, the work that they do, and Voice of America is tremendous. But one of the things about information that is so important, and we must work on information, and I'd be remiss. The new policies we must advocate for the new administration is human rights up front, meaning human rights as a major element of our policy, a free and unified Korea, and an information campaign. And that information campaign is the connective tissue between human rights and a free and unified Korea. And one of the fundamentals of human rights, in addition to the fact that it's a moral imperative and a national security issue because Kim Jong-un must deny human rights in order to remain in power, but one of the elements we should consider is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 21, which says that a fundamental human right is self-determination of government. And the Korean people in the North have never had that opportunity to determine their own government. And so we need to send information into the North. And information, like the air power theorists, it may be lost on you, the bomber always gets through. well, information always gets through, and it's getting through. When you talk to the North Korean diaspora, they are getting information. They are listening to Radio Free Asia. And I'm happy to report one of the greatest examples from the Cold War was the example of free countries in the West and throughout the world. The examples of the United States, our culture, our political system. And according to RFA reports this week, envied our election that just took place. And no matter what you think about your politics, they said that they were so impressed and are so envious that there could be an election where the people actually decided who their new leaders would be. And one comment was that even somebody who raised less money could still beat somebody who raised more money. And they said that goes against everything that they have learned inside North Korea. And so just the example of our election is as tense and frustrating it may be for some, as divided our country is, that's still an example. And that's an example, and that's the kind of information that we need to get into. We need to be an example. And South Korea is the example for the North. I mean, there is no better example to show the Korean people in the North how they can live, because the Koreans in the South have proved that. And I'll just say, you hear me, my awkward phrasing of Koreans in the South and Koreans in the North. The reason I speak like that is to emphasize there is only one Korea. And someday it will be a free and unified Korea. I'll stop there.
Dave, thank you very much. A lot of great points. The red line in Romania, it was the Romanian military using lethal force against unarmed civilians. Okay, you're starving us, you're oppressing us. This is it. We've had it. The end. My question to our friends in the North Korean diaspora is always, what is the red line in North Korea? We don't know yet. We don't know it yet. We will find out. Oh, shut down the markets? We just don't know. We will find out again. Then you made a very important point about the cost of unification versus the benefits of unification. Of course, the German president is extraordinary, but let us focus on the benefits of unification as well. Then a third point that I'd like to emphasize is Kim Jong-un's abandonment of one of the fundamental tenets of Kim Il-sung ideology, which is unification. Why? Reason number one, he's trying to elevate his own cult of personality at the expense of his grandfather's cult of personality. Number two, Taehyung, Kenji, Grace, you were at the event with the Secretary General of the Peaceful Unification Advisory Council, His Excellency Tae Yong-ho. He made this point. Young people in North Korea, half of the population of North Korea is 35 or younger. Many of them are addicted to cultural imports. South Korean culture smuggled into North Korea. That's what Kim Jong-un truly fears, and thus he has abandoned this idea of unification. A great opportunity, as you said, Dave. There's the 815 vision that President Yoon Suk-yeol has put forth, a true vision, a very coherent vision for Korean unification. We're here to help. That's the whole point of getting together today, so that's how it goes. We still have a little bit of time for some questions, if you have any. Please go ahead, and please remember, Kenji, go ahead.
Thank you. So, as Kenji, this foundation, thank you for the great event and there's hope for unification. So on the other hand, we need to prepare for unification. Then North Korea has a huge oppression to the people. People has a lot of resentment to government official. Then transition time, so rule of law or some judge should be accountable. But can you tell us about the German or Romanian or like a military can prevent some uprising every local level, such a resentment from people to against the government officials?
Okay, did I understand you correctly that you wanted to understand how why the German military, the East German military didn't stop all these protests and the opening of the wall? Was that your question?
Yeah, some good some good system for prevent some conflict within people, local people to government people. So even so because until now huge operation 70 years, 80 years. So but if you
Retribution against government officials by the people. That
Oh,
how
that's
do you
the
prevent-
question?
Yeah.
yeah
Okay, okay. Well, most of the top government officials ultimately were put on trial in United Germany for being behind the order to stop anyone from trying to escape, if necessary, by shooting. So there were over 500 trials in the 90s. I think the last one was 2004. In fact, there's one until the one that's been going on right now of a Polish citizen who was shot at the Berlin Wall. So there was concern after unification that people in the East would seek retribution against, that citizens from the East would seek retribution, in particular against the secret police. That was the focus in Germany. For better or worse, the focus of anger of East Germans and therefore the focus of anger of East Germans was the secret police, the Stasi. It wasn't political leaders per se, even though the Stasi reported to the political leaders. And so there was a lot of concern when the German government passed a law which each German citizens had insisted on. United German government passed a law to open up the secret police archives to anyone who wanted to read their file, and to professors like me and journalists who were going to write about how was this police state, how did it operate. So there was fear when they did that. Will there be retribution? Will people be reading their file and, oh my God, he spied on me or she spied on me? I don't know why me. There wasn't. I've never heard of even one instance of violent retribution against the officials.
So that I think brings up a great point, and I think about preparation. And I think what Kenji's getting to is, what could we do now from an information perspective, and South Korea could do in terms of establishing plans and processes for really transitional justice. That's really what we're talking about ahead of time, and then communicate that to the Korean people in the North, that there will be justice, but I think naturally everybody would want to minimize that kind of retribution. So I don't have an answer for it, but the question is, what can South Korea do now to prepare the Korean people in the North, and really all Korean people, to prevent that kind of retribution and ensure that there is a fair and just process to deal with those who have conducted, crimes against humanity.
I will, one more point on that, though, it ultimately became a very controversial process, these trials of former East German officials. Now, the officials, of course, said this is victor's justice, but ultimately, there was a sense on the part of victims, people who, their brother, their son was killed trying to escape. And, they had to go through this process, in a court of law. And many of them were very frustrated at the demands of evidence, and that the judges in many cases found them guilty because usually, the Germans kept great files. So it was perfectly clear, the Stasi kept great files who pulled the trigger and what happened. And the guys usually confessed. But they said, I was ordered to. What was I supposed to do? These were my orders. And so for people who lost a family member, they aren't at all happy with the fact that most people got commuted sentences. They were told, you're guilty, normally you would have to serve, 3 or 4 years in prison, but because in a legal system we consider, are you likely to do that again? And no, the wall doesn't exist anymore. So a lot of them didn't have to go to jail. And so the family members of victims were very, very angry. Others from the East were frustrated that, their whole system was put on trial, they felt. So there was resentment about that.
And Kenji, very briefly, because you also asked about Romania. Romania is a great country right now, a staunch friend, ally, partner in the United States, NATO member state, EU member state. Okay, the second echelon of the Communist Party took over in the early 1990s. Former Securitate, military, senior military officers, party officials, so no transitional justice. Ordinary people had no idea what was going on. Then their children took over. I guess you cannot have capitalism without capitalists. And they had the connections, the know-how. They were the ones who could travel abroad before that. And they were the ones who had the capital, right? The end result of that is that for a population of 20 million, 4 to 5 million people like me have been driven out and are still living overseas. That's 20 to 25% of the population. That's a very high number. Some very hard feelings there, I have to say. But we get over it. So again, no transitional justice. You get some fellow who used to be a prison guard at one of the political prison camps in the 1950s. He's 97 years old. And Roberta sends me the article in the Washington Post. I said, oh yeah, they got this guy. The next day he dies. He's 97. That was transitional justice in Romania. Could have been a much better run process, and that's why the transition was so difficult compared to Germany, compared to Poland, compared to the others. Okay, but that's all I had to say about that. Perhaps the next program will come in due course. Please, Dave.
So I think this is the first, and you might have seen it on the slides, and you might have heard Greg refer to it, but Greg is the president and chief executive officer of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, unanimously appointed by the board. And so that is his title. He is deserving of that title, but I just want to make sure that everybody, that's not just a subtle change. This is a very important change. And so I offer my congratulations to Greg as the president and CEO.
Thank you all for your support, especially the board members of HRNK and Roberta, our co-chair emeritus. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us today. Roberta, Bob, Hope, Dave, this has been a terrific event. We've recorded it. We'll share it with our friends and colleagues in South Korea, the Ministry of Unification, and all of those who follow us. A very important note, 9 a.m. this Friday, we're hosting a virtual program on the abduction issue. Abductions by North Korea, Japanese nationals, nationals of other countries. If possible, please RSVP, please tune in. We're going to have some terrific speakers. That said, I know it's not easy. Thank you so much for being here today, and please join me in thanking our terrific speakers. Of course, Natalie, and Alex, and James, and Chujin, our awesome HRNK crew. Thank you for very good and hard work.